All right, hello everyone. Welcome to a debate. I am joined by Gennady Stolyarov II, the who is an actuary, a writer, and the chair of the American Transhumanist Party, which we are going to talk about a little bit. Gennady, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our exchange today. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I have been the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party since November 2016. So I have led this organization for over 8.5 years of what is now a 10.5 year existence. I am a transhumanist, and I have been a transhumanist all my life. Essentially, ever since I learned about death, I recognized the injustice of it, as I think most kids do. The difference between me and other children is that I never stopped recognizing the injustice of death, and I could never accept the common cultural rationalizations, justifications, excuses, perhaps, for human mortality. And instead, I tried to figure out ways by which humankind could overcome death. But it was in 2004, so now 21 years ago, that I became an explicit transhumanist. That was when I learned about transhumanism as a philosophy. And my first exposure to explicitly transhumanist thinking came in the form of the writings of Dr. Aubrey de Grey on his old Cambridge University website, where he outlined his SENS program. SENS stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence, and it is a damage repair approach, which identifies the seven principal causes of aging related damage, the seven principal types of damage that can be potentially reversed through the application of emerging technologies. And it was then that I realized this is feasible within my lifetime if humankind devotes enough energy and resources to this task. And then also, not long thereafter, I learned about the philosophy of extropy being the opposite of entropy, through the writings of Max More, another key transhumanist thinker. And then I read The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil, and over time I became exposed to other transhumanist thinkers, including David Pearce, David Wood, Anders Sandberg, and these thinkers have shaped my view of the world. In large part, they inspired me to chart the course of my life outside of my actuarial career. So, what do I do with the rest of my time? And I've written articles. I have my publication, The Rational Argumentator. I also wrote this book. It's Death is Wrong, the world's first, no longer the only book on indefinite life extension for kids, but it was the first book back in 2013. And in it, I relate my own story, how as a kid I refused to accept mortality. And I try to inspire the next generation to become scientists, technologists, advocates who can help us overcome this greatest of all problems.
I was smiling as you told your story there because my amateur interest, because like you, I have a day job. I'm an electrician. But my amateur interest is in the classics, and the hatred of death is literally the oldest story we have in Gilgamesh. This struggle to find some solution to this problem, and one could argue that it's a key theme in my favorite set of texts, which is Homer's Iliad in particular, not as much the Odyssey, but the Iliad. This longing for immortality, though there it is achieved by death. So there's some interesting complexities there. But let's this is going to devolve into a debate at some point. Because I have listened to some of your videos now. You've listened to my podcast against transhumanism. Um, but I do think it's fun to start on the points of agreement. Um, there's a public intellectual, I guess, named Balaji Srinivasan. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, who has asserted that the future of American politics is less going to be Republicans versus Democrats, and it's more going to be transhumanists versus anarcho-primitivists. I think that's such a more interesting frame because you have actual aesthetic ideals that people are striving for rather than, I mean, the Republican and the Democratic Party are not really um like ideological platforms so much as they are just infrastructures built for political power that can adopt any number of positions, including each other's positions if we cross decades, that seem to only be interested in power. So to have something like anarcho-primitivism and something like transhumanism saying, no, here are alternative ideals of what we want human life to be like, feels like a feels like an improvement in the political metapolitical conversation, which is cool. And I tend to side in the direction of the anarcho-primitivists, but I really like technology. I think technology is really cool. And I think the opposition to technology goes back to an opposition to techne, to skill and craft itself, which is also a part of who we are, to use technology and craft to accomplish our goals is part of what it is to be human. But then we get, and I'd like you to ask you maybe to start on this. Why is this ideology called transhumanism? Because what you've described is a very, I would say, beautiful and admirable love of life. Like I like this. I want this to continue. Um, we could call that life extensionism. We could call that biological immortalism. We could be like Greenland sharks or whatever. Um, why why is it called transhumanism? And my understanding of the answer to that is that while immortality is one of the goals of transhumanism, it's not the only goal. And the driving goal of transhumanism is to become what Nick Bostrom calls post-human. Is that your position? And can you tell me a little bit about what your position is on post-humanism?
So I am actually a transhumanist, but not a posthumanist. So I don't use
Oh,
the
okay.
posthuman terminology, even though some transhumanists do. But if you look at the prefix trans, the Latin prefix trans, of course, today it's so grievously misunderstood that people
Right.
think anything with the prefix trans has to do with gender. And I have to ask them, well, did everybody who work on the Transcontinental Railroad change their gender? Does transcending mean changing one's gender?
Yeah.
Does transforming something mean changing its gender? No. So the prefix trans has actually several meanings in Latin. One is
Can I interrupt for a
beyond.
second? I
Yes,
just as a point of empathy, I wrote a book that had a subtitle about transgenerational ethics, and this
yes.
I got so much good-natured mocking from my friends on that point, but I share your frustration on that.
Indeed, indeed. So trans could mean beyond, so to transcend, to go beyond, or trans could mean through, as in the example of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad goes through the continent. So when one looks at the term transhumanist
Hmm.
or transhumanism, one can understand it as both going beyond the historic limitations of humanity, but also achieving some better outcomes through one's humanity. And if
Hmm.
you think about what humans have been doing for the entirety of our species' existence, we have been striving to go beyond the status quo, to go beyond our present condition, whether that be by harnessing fire or stone tools or developing writing or building cities or creating machines or pioneering medical approaches to curing diseases and lengthening lifespans. All of that has already been practiced for centuries and in some cases for millennia or tens or hundreds of millennia. So if that's the case, then transhumanism is a manifestation of a profoundly human tendency, which is to use our humanity and our human drives, our human faculties to go beyond the limits of our humanity. So, what are those limits historically and still today? Unfortunately, mortality is one of them, the susceptibility to disease, to frailty. But that's not the entirety of it. And this is where you pointed out transhumanism isn't just about overcoming death. We're also faced with tremendous material scarcity. We're faced with various existential risks, like an asteroid could hit the Earth and wipe out higher orders of life, or we could have a supervolcano erupt. We could have a variety of cataclysms, and some of those cataclysms could even be man-made. Nuclear war, in my view, is the greatest existential risk in the foreseeable future. And nuclear war is a man-made existential risk, but it stems from these very primeval tendencies of the human psyche, tendencies toward conflict,
Hmm.
arising out of irrational emotions, out of cognitive biases that can sometimes ensnare even the most intelligent humans. And transhumanism seeks to overcome those as well. So,
So would it
whom
be fair
will
to
we
say
be?
that transhumanism seeks to change and alter human nature itself in a way that makes it feel free to correct this if I'm incorrect here, but to make it more rational.
More rational and more aligned with reality, the objective well being of humans, and hopefully the objective well being of other sentient life forms to the extent that we discover them or create them or uplift them, whatever we do. Our ability to empathize with others, other humans, other sentient entities would also improve as we remove the deleterious limits of what has historically been human nature. Now, I do think human nature is not fixed, it is contingent. It is contingent on what we are able to do. So, Steven Pinker documented this extensively in his book, The
Mhm.
Better Angels of Our Nature. He showed that historically, more primitive societies have tended to be much more violent, and they've had other practices like normalized rape or slavery, which was ubiquitous throughout the ancient world. And yet, those practices have largely at least been driven underground, and the
Mhm.
moral frameworks that every civilized society operates by anywhere in the world would reject those kinds of practices. So we have made progress, and I think our human natures are different in certain key ways from our primeval ancestors, but we also have a way to go. And I think our physical limitations fundamentally prevent us from being the best humans that we could be. So transhumanism doesn't seek to eliminate humans or get rid of our humanity. It seeks to preserve us as individuals and the best parts of our humanity while
Mhm.
removing those deleterious parts that hold us back.
Right. Okay. So my understanding is more or less correct then, as far as what becoming post-human entails, not just in terms of immortality, but also eliminating those parts of our psychology that violate the proposed trajectory of the progress of civilization, more or less. Can
You
I?
could say that. Now, if you want to use the term post-human for it, I think that would be a semantic matter. I think those
Sure.
beings would very much still be human. Indeed, they would be us. So
Hmm.
I propose that we as individuals become those beings, whether you call them post-human or augmented human or
Yeah.
better human or freer human, those beings would be us individually.
Well, I ask because first of all, can I ask if you would consider yourself to be a utilitarian or not, as far as ethics are concerned?
So I wouldn't call myself a utilitarian because utilitarianism tries to intercompare utility across individuals. So utilitarianism often operates by the maxim of
Mhm.
the greatest good for the greatest number. But I am not comfortable with sacrificing any individual for the purported good of others, of any other number of individuals. So
Sure.
for me, the individual is the paramount, indivisible unit of morality, and an action cannot be moral if it imposes involuntary harms on individuals, at the very least, without compensating them for those harms in some way that they would find suitable.
Okay, fair enough. I think the reason utilitarianism jumps to mind when you describe this is if we are if we are aiming for a trajectory of improving the human condition, including the human psyche, including what we should want. You shouldn't want revenge. You shouldn't want to rape your neighbor and all that. Then that implies the sort of imposition of an objective outside notion of good that is above and which supersedes the preferences of the individual. So utilitarianism seems to be in line with that. Um,
Well, I do think there's an objective good. Now,
okay.
that objective good, to paraphrase Ayn Rand, would come with a question: good to whom and for what?
Hmm.
And I would say you can't impose some particular, let's say, course of action on somebody unless it is to prevent that person from harming others. So, for instance, in the transhumanist vision of the future, we would not force technological improvements or any sort of technology upon people who are not willing to accept it. So the Amish would be allowed to live in their communities and
Hmm.
accept or reject any technologies they see fit. Now, it's interesting, though, because the Amish are not techno Luddites. They just have a very deliberative approach toward what technologies they do accept, but they do accept a lot of modern medicine. And
Right.
they will go to hospitals to treat and cure certain diseases that would have killed their ancestors because they don't see that as contrary to their teachings. So
Right.
in the future, there would be a great diversity of choices. People could mix and match technologies. They could choose to adopt some emerging technologies and not others. So this would be a future of individual hyper empowerment and hyper pluralism. And in my view, that is aligned with a broader objective good because a system or a society or a universe that is aimed toward an objective good will try to maximize the flourishing of every individual and give every individual the choice and the opportunity to pursue his, her, its, their own path. Even if I would pursue a different path, I'm not going to force my way onto others.
Right. I like that idea from you mentioned existential risk, and perhaps we'll get more into that later. From an existential risk perspective, diversity of lifestyles is a point of resilience for the species, which is just kind of cool. And it's also just neat to have here are these people doing that thing. Here's the Amish who like this technology, but that. There's the Taliban over there. They don't like modern music, but they love AKs, so they can do their thing over there.
Well, as long
You
as
know,
they don't harm others. So could
well,
we
right,
convince them over some amount of time? It wouldn't be easy, but instead of invading their country, could we show them a better way?
right.
I
Well,
know this seems very optimistic from today's standpoint, but the old ideal of the shining city on a hill actually
mhm.
comes to mind. And there is a city like that behind me in my background. I
I
call it the
like it.
city of new anti-death. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. So could we show people in other societies an example of what are some ways in which life could be better, and then give them a choice, accept those ways or not.
Well, the question of harm is an interesting one. It's a classic challenge to libertarians, and it dovetails into another question, which is um, how exactly do we measure this objective, what is objectively best for people? Because from the Taliban's perspective, they might look at American cities, the homelessness, the poverty, the drug addiction, that is to them the byproduct of freedom, which allows for vice traps and baits into hazard and things of this nature, and say, the American government is imposing harm on its people. They need to be liberated. And this was indeed the experience, or something like the experience, of Osama bin Laden, purportedly. Now, what he views as a harm, we would say is freedom and some individual choice. And what we view as harm in Pashtunwali and in the very severe religious rule of the Taliban, they would view as piety, virtue, and looking out for each other. The rate of drug addiction and homelessness is substantially lower in Kabul today than it is in my home city, sort of Seattle. So, like, there is a if we are to respect the individual, there is a subjectivity in terms of what we consider to be good, that I think gets really, which doesn't challenge at all the project of transhumanism you're describing as a sort of private enterprise. Here's Brian Johnson trying to, you know, live longer. He's got an 18-year-old's erection or whatever. Cool. But as soon as it becomes a political project, and if for just to bring the audience up to this, the three tenets of your political platform are, if I remember correctly, life extension, secular human values as far as culturally, politically, and prioritizing existential risk. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
essentially, those are the three core ideals of the U.S. Transhumanist Party.
Hmm.
And I will say there is an objective set of prerequisites to human survival and flourishing. So the Taliban are not wrong when they say that being homeless is not good for a person, or abusing drugs is not good for a person, even though they would sell that person those very drugs. That's how they funded a lot of their operations. But I would say the key question is what set of incentives, systems, prerogatives allow individuals the maximal opportunity to flourish. And it's certainly not living under a theocracy. If you consider from the standpoint of in what societies does technology develop the most rapidly to enable overcoming the physical barriers to flourishing? In what society could homelessness actually be solved? I
Okay.
would say we have the technological means to solve homelessness. We need the proper incentives to do it. And transhumanists are all in favor of, for instance, massive expansions of new home construction, including through emerging technologies like 3D printing.
I want to challenge you on this one, and I think this could lead to an interesting conversation. The second part of your platform, secular human values. Um, I am, and I understand this is a somewhat eccentric position. I don't believe there are such things as values which are not religious. And I think the history of science in the West is a byproduct of two things in combination. First of all, the hero cult of Socrates. And you could do a worse hero cult than with Socrates as its center. This idea of learning for the sake of learning and the pursuit of knowledge without the belief that you possess knowledge. That's what that the spirit of Socrates is, the center, the motivating moral driver behind science. And then that got accentuated by certain medieval Christian ideas, about natural theology and God reveals himself through nature, so we're going to study nature because that's how we get closer to an invisible God or whatever. I don't think you need that to get science. We already had the beginnings of it in the Greek world without that. But I do think that is actually a byproduct of religion in the broader sense. And I'm not a Christian. I'm not a monotheist at all. I don't think that's y frankly that interesting. But I, I'm curious what your idea of secular values entails.
Yes. So secular values and the second core ideal of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, which, by the way, says the Transhumanist Party supports a cultural, societal, and political atmosphere informed and animated by reason, science, and secular values. So
Mhm.
the reason and science also clarify the secular values a bit, but really the secular values do not mean there is no religion or people in the society are not religious at all. It just means that a particular religious framework is not used to impose involuntary constraints upon people. So, for example, a secular society could have freedom of religion, and somebody could be a Christian, somebody could be an atheist, somebody could be a polytheist, somebody could have your religious views, and yet they're all bound by common laws, common standards, and protections as well that are independent of their individual religious views. So a secular society does not give a special status to somebody for being of a particular religion or not. And in a secular society, it's even possible to disagree with the ideological foundation of that society and still have one's rights respected. So in a
But the
transhumanist,
but the rule of law itself comes from religious ideas and religious theory. It is the respect for the rule of law is essentially maintained by ceremonial magic. Judges in courtrooms wear black robes and swing gavels, and we have special, you know, badges and insignias, and everything is done in this hyper formal way, and we all take it seriously as a result of that. By magic, I don't mean like actual like hocus pocus. I mean basically psychological principles of what people take seriously and so forth. But
well, I think to respond to that, the respect for the rule of law can stem from purely practical or pragmatic considerations, as in if we all agree to this common framework, that's better than each man being a judge in his own case. And John Locke wrote about this because he recognized that humans have these cognitive biases or emotions. They're always going to be predisposed to rule in their favor. And if
mhm,
everybody does that, then it's just a matter of might makes right. So one could think of hypothetical humans who make the decision to be bound by laws entirely from an enlightened self-interest perspective. Now,
mhm,
in practice, could these ceremonial elements be persuasive to some people? Sure. And again, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, if putting somebody in a uniform makes it more likely that they will be listened to in enforcing the laws, then that could be a reasonable decision to make. But
mhm,
somebody doesn't have to necessarily say, oh, this has some sort of special or supernatural kind of significance. It could be a purely pragmatic calculus. I actually suspect early religions were founded in sometimes entirely pragmatic contexts like this was recognized as a framework that could lead to greater cohesion of a particular tribe. And some clever individuals devised some stories or some rituals that kept the people attached to that vision. And of course, over the course of generations, that could have transformed into genuine belief, including among the elites of that tribe or community or civilization as it developed. But really, the point of secular values is somebody doesn't have to believe in that specific framework in order to have their rights, their ability to function in that framework be respected. So, as I was going to say, in a transhumanist society, an anarcho-primitivist could come in, and as long as they don't attack anybody or try to destroy the technologies of that society, we would say, well, you're allowed to believe as you do, you're allowed to live as you do, and to criticize us and disagree with us and propose your own ways of being, but we have these ground rules here.
I was chuckling because there is an account from Cicero of the second emperor of Rome, Numa Pompilius, who apparently designed the Romans were apparently very bloodthirsty at the time, and so he designed a very elaborate set of religious rituals that required a lot of time and had a lot of ceremonies, basically just to keep them busy, so they wouldn't go and invade people. So we have accounts of that. Um, but I do think that religion, like it might do that in some cases. It clearly has in some cases. But I think it at a deeper level, religion and the sacred stories, the myths, which aren't necessarily untrue, they can be not literal, but they are sacred stories. They are special stories that give meaning and direction and valuation because in the absence of some story from it, and I wasn't trying to pin you as a utilitarian, but so insofar as we're talking about objective metrics for flourishing or not, the utilitarian framework kind of jumps out. And in the absence of stories that give direction to our suffering, most people throughout history have eventually come to the conclusion that the suffering outweighs the pleasure and that life is actually not worth it. And the you see hints of an not just an anti-natalist but an anti-mortalist sentiment creep in like the wisdom of Silenus in the Greeks or the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. More blessed are those who have not yet been born, for they have not seen the evil that is done under the sun, and so forth. And so it is these stories of and like to put it in sort of concrete terms, millions of Americans multiple times a week go to the gym, myself included, to work out. Absent some kind of story of a trajectory of growth, that is just pain they're subjecting themselves to. But stories can give meaning to that pain that can actually make it positive. And so I think there is a danger in being too rational and too objective in in what we consider good in life to be. And I think the ultimate trajectory of rationalism as applied to the human animal, we have to ditch these myths, we have to ditch these hero cults, we have to ditch religion and the supernatural. And so I don't believe in the supernatural myself, but some people do. Um, is this anti-mortalist position? Is
So I, mhm.
Oh,
I'm
go
not
ahead.
opposed to stories.
Mhm.
I don't think that we should discard our tendency toward telling stories or enjoying narratives. In fact, I think one of the greatest problems of the postmodern age is the deconstruction of too many narratives. Now, some historical narratives have been problematic and they needed to be challenged, but the problem is the postmodernists challenged not only the problematic narratives, but the narratives that did inspire people and give people meaning and give people motivation to pursue great things. This
Mhm.
is where transhumanism can actually come in and remedy that problem as the next paradigm after postmodernism, in that we could have better narratives.
Well,
We could have narratives
you're
that relate
dovetailing.
to our concrete situation.
Right. You're dovetailing into one of my favorite bits of transhumanist writing, which is Nick Bostrom's fable of the Dragon Tyrant, which is very
Exactly.
mythic in its, I mean, it is a myth essentially. And
Yes.
then you get Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, which uses very mythic imagery to describe what science is in the face of darkness and the unknown and so forth. Um,
Yes.
but the point of me bringing this up is it wasn't intended to be this crazy tangent of my own thought, but the challenge it imposes to this idea of secular values and a separation of church and state, even because at the end of the day, what the state is force, and it uses this force to arbitrate um, disagreements, and it is guided by the values of that society. If it's not, it's a tyranny, right? Um, so it always imposes its essentially religious beliefs. And, America's guiding religious ethos has been a sort of civic religion of democracy. Um, and this myth of a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, which is why Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, Democracy, the God That Failed, has such, I mean, that's a very potent title because it does get at what democracy is to many people. And then when we saw, the cycles of media stories about that where everyone is saying such and such is a threat to our democracy, um,
Right.
that is religious language, essentially. And if you challenge that religious language, it might not be supernatural, but you can get yourself in a lot of trouble politically and legally if you challenge the orthodoxy of the state. So the ideal you talk about having essentially a private project of like, look, we're going to expand the possibilities of human life. We can have people living this way over here. We're going to create a framework that everyone can live the way they want. Um, I don't know if that's possible within a single political state because that has to be bound together by a shared story, by a shared mythos and ethos that follows from that mythos. And the question is, what is the mythos underlying the transhuman focus on science, progress, potentially immortality, um, if it is not the hero cult of Socrates? Is it the fable of the dragon tyrant, or what is the guiding ideal story?
Hmm. Well, I think the fable of the dragon tyrant is a great story because it does have this gripping quality, and it does, in very powerful illustrations, show the deeper aspirations of the transhumanist project. And
Mhm.
I am not averse to more such stories being written. I'm not averse to historic myths and stories being repurposed or reinterpreted in a transhumanist light. So I have a short
Gilgamesh.
story that I wrote.
I need
Yes,
to read your
Gilgamesh
story.
is a good example. A short story that I wrote called Sisyphus Vindicated, which is the
Hmm.
story of Sisyphus in the underworld being sentenced to roll the boulder uphill, and then it keeps rolling down, and he finds a way to make the best of his predicament. And the story is about what he does with this task that actually leads him to overcome the gods who sentenced him to this ordeal. So it is, I think, fitting to craft such stories, but I think the difference between a dogmatically religious society and a secular society is that a secular society will say outright, yes, these are myths. You may find some usefulness in them, you may find some purpose in them, recognize that they are myths and deploy
So
them as such.
so so
But
when
it's not
I
against deploying the myth.
when I say the word myth, I mean it in the Greek sense of it being a sacred story. When you say myth, do you mean just a story, or do you mean just like do you mean something else by that?
Well, it's a story that conveys some sort of deeper meaning, some sort of more enduring significance. But when reading a myth, one recognizes that the events described therein were not necessarily factual. Maybe they had some grain of truth in them, but were
Mhm.
embellished throughout the ages or altered in order to convey that deeper meaning. So a myth, I would say, is fundamentally fiction, it could have elements of historical fiction, but it's fiction aimed toward a deeper purpose and
Right.
either intentionally constructed or retold throughout the ages to be directed toward that deeper purpose. And again, I don't think that's bad per se, and it's
Sure.
fine even for people who are atheists to enjoy mythology, to enjoy, say, Greek mythology or Norse mythology, or here are some more controversial statements: Hebrew mythology, Christian mythology, Buddhist mythology. The only reason why these are more controversial statements is because the religions that deploy these myths are still extant. So, in
Right.
3,000 years, let's say Christianity morphs into something else and doesn't call itself Christianity anymore, just as a
Unitarianism.
hypothetical.
Yeah.
Yeah, then you could say, well, I enjoy looking at the Christian mythology of the first 2 millennia CE, something
Right.
like that.
Right. I think that this matters insofar as these myths are not just stories we enjoy as hobbies, because they shape, you mentioned before the caveat to your society, not just yours, to many people's idea of a free society is so long as we're not doing harm. But that's a big asterisk because it is from these myths that we get the idea of what constitutes harm. And like a more close at home example of this might be when someone like Richard Dawkins says, bringing up your child religious is essentially child abuse. That is shifting from, one could say, it's shifting from an opinion into something more like a legal standard. And you can, I mean, it's not, it is literally just one guy's opinion. But to call something child abuse is similar to saying, oh, something is domestic abuse in like the context of a relationship, or like it is appropriating legal terminology of something that should be prohibited. Harm, if harm is prohibited, if from a libertarian perspective, the initiation of force, if you can define what force is, then you can control all kinds of things. And this was like in the Fable of the Dragon Tyrant. Nick Bostrom is so clever in the way he brings forward the religious scholars as saying it is the nature of the dragon to eat us, and it is in our nature to be eaten, as if these opinions are just a kind of Stockholm syndrome associated with death. And but if that doesn't work, then you could say, well, these religious people that are persuading other people not to pursue immortality are doing harm. And from a mathematical perspective, that would be correct. Just like the very terrifying mathematics behind existential risk can say, as Nick Bostrom did at one of his TED Talks, that it might be wise to allow several hundred million people to die if it reduced the existential risk of some threat by 3%, you know, because all of humanity being eliminated is incalculably worse than all but 200 of humanity being eliminated. It's not just the difference of 200 people in that context. There's something more absolute and final, as you say in your, why death is bad videos from 16 years ago. There's something final to extinction. But what that justifies legally begins to get very scary. And
So,
who's to decide? I'm
I,
sorry, I opened a
right.
bunch of cans of worms there.
Yes. So I want to make sure I emphasize this. I don't think Bostrom is arguing for the intentional elimination of hundreds of millions
I
of humans just so
I
that the
didn't mean to
human
imply that.
species
Yeah.
continues. Yes, yes. I think the situation in which he would have made such a statement would be something like, well, if we deploy safeguards against existential risk, it would be a good idea, even in the worst situations, to make sure that at least some humans survive. Like if there's some calamity that befalls the Earth, like an asteroid impact of the size that eliminated the dinosaurs, for instance, wouldn't it be good to have colonies off world? Wouldn't it be good to have really good shelters, say underground shelters, in the event of that kind of impact or a nuclear war or any other planet-wide catastrophe so that at least some humans could survive? And I think he was saying, well, qualitatively speaking, a disaster where most people are wiped out, but the human species continues is less bad than a
Yeah.
situation where all human life is wiped out. I would say, yeah, that's a no-brainer that
Hmm.
it's less bad. Now, we don't want either of those
Right.
situations,
I,
and we
I,
want
I,
to prevent any death.
right. Well, apologies for bringing up that digression a little bit because that was a digression. But the main point I was trying to get to was that these stories that we tell dictate what is harmful. And like if you believe in the story of Islam, for example, then what's going on in the Free Society of America is, of course, objectively more harmful. Um, Objective within their framework that we can get into what is objectivity, perhaps. Because I am an objectivity skeptic when it comes to moral value questions. But the story that we tell with either the fable of the dragon tyrant or the myth of progress, and again, I don't mean myth in the denigrating sense. We have, I think, on the left is guided by the myth of progress, and the right is guided by the myth of the golden age. And I subscribe more to Nietzsche's myth of eternal return, that we're kind of in the same psychological place again and again. But like these stories dictate what we consider to be harmful. And so it wouldn't someone who is challenging the project of immortality be committing harm.
No, not necessarily, because there are facts. There are not just myths or stories. Facts exist as well. And
Mm.
what is involuntarily harmful to a biological organism is pretty specific. So, various physical perils can destroy or disrupt an organism, biological processes, diseases, aging. Those are all involuntary harms. If somebody makes sound vibrations in air, I don't have to alter my behavior on the basis of those sound vibrations. Maybe those sound vibrations are interesting to me, and maybe I choose to adhere to what they're communicating according to my interpretation of them. But there are so many layers between a speaker saying something and the recipient of that communication taking an action that in most cases, I would say it's not harm to hear an idea. Now, there could be situations like if there's a demagogue inciting a mob to violence and the people in the mob have been riled up and predisposed already to let their guard down, so they are disinhibited from following the orders of that demagogue. It could be that the demagogue himself isn't looting or burning or killing people, but he's definitely calling on others to do that. So incitement is not free speech
John
in
Stuart Mill's standard.
many cases. Right, right, exactly, exactly. But John Stuart Mill also had a very expansive definition of what free speech is. And he
Mm.
pointed out that hearing views contrary to one's own can be beneficial in many situations. One, if you're wrong, then you find out that you're wrong.
Yes, of
Two,
course.
if you're right, you figure out better ways
Hmm.
to express the true ideas that you hold and defend them against challenges. So
Yes.
I think in most cases, it's not correct to assume that other people can just be passively influenced by those who hold incorrect views. And it may even be better for a society from the standpoint of the correct views winning out to allow the incorrect views to challenge.
Yeah. No, I like that position myself. The I think the point about what determines harm goes beyond that, beyond speech, and perhaps I was too limited. Maybe a better example of this would be corporal punishment. Spanking and things
Right.
like that with kids. Uh, Not terribly long ago, and still in some societies, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, which has a very high Asian population. Corporal punishment is very popular among even wealthy parents from certain parts of East Asia. It's considered almost neglect, asterisk, emphasis on almost, to not incentivize your children to behave better and to get better grades and so forth with the threat or reality of corporal punishment. In the United States, many subcultures within the United States consider that to be abuse warranting the removal of children from their parents. So that's not a matter of speech, but a matter of belief in what constitutes harm. Now, some people have interpreted the verse from the Bible, spare the rod, spoil the child, as condoning that. Of course, it's a shepherding metaphor about guiding people, not hitting them. But
Right.
but but the interpretation existed prior to the biblical verse, probably. You know, that it's good to show them or whatever. I have mixed feelings on the two because I've seen children grow up in both contexts and do well, and children grow up from both contexts and do poorly. Um, I'm not sure I see a strong correlation one way or the other myself, and I'm sure some people will bring up or try to bring up data on it. But what's considered harmful still has a subjective quality, and you mentioned there are certain facts that we bring up here. Um, this is where like Hume's guillotine keeps coming back, where the fact uh, of our current existence is that we die. We are not biologically immortal. But the aspiration that you're describing of transhumanism is to overcome this fact and to change the facts. And so
Yes.
that ideal does not come from the facts. It comes from something above and beyond the facts. It comes from something like a beautiful story of us, beating this dragon.
Yeah. Well, the story can inspire, but we could also simply like our current state of existence and want it to continue. So, a
Mhm.
common illustration that transhumanists and life extensionists will provide is, let's say you wake up tomorrow and your life is pretty good. You're able to achieve all your goals, enjoy the experiences you enjoy, and you're asked the question, well, would you want to repeat this for another day? And you're going to say yes, unless you have some sort of like mental imbalance. But if you say yes on that day, then on the next day you wake up and again, you get to live life the way you want. Are you going to say yes to prolonging it another day? And if you do, let's say this continues for 100 years. Let's say this continues for 1,000 years. As long as you at that time are able to say, yes, I'm enjoying the experience of life, you're going to say yes to the question, should I prolong it? And transhumanists are trying to make that choice available to people, irrespective of arbitrary time limits. Again, we're not going to force that choice upon individuals, but yes, you need to address the facts of reality. You need to address the biological facts that lead the human
Mhm.
organism to age and decay and become more susceptible to diseases over time, which really does depress the experience of life. But if you could overcome those, then the new set of facts would lead people to say, yes, I embrace life. So to consider what leads people not to embrace life, it is suffering, which you mentioned, it is infirmity, it is pain, it is the inability to do what one would like to do or what one used to be able to do. But what if we could remove all of those problems? And we would have to in order to dramatically extend human lifespan, because you can't really go much beyond today's record holders, the super centenarians, by extending sick span. You have to extend what's called health span and the span of biological youthfulness in order to extend total lifespan. So that's
Mhm.
what we are seeking to do. And I think the motivation to want to live can stem from a variety of factors. I think they are often, for an individual, interrelated and mutually reinforcing. So, from my standpoint as a transhumanist, I want as many of those factors to be in play as possible for a given person so that they make the decision of their own free will to pursue their own life extension and to help others get there as well.
Yeah. I think as you would feel as you described it, watching like the Amish do their thing, watching people pursue life extension technology and brain alteration stuff to change the human experience. I think it's more than just interesting. I think it's really cool. I think there's a special place of honor for scientists who experiment on themselves, who have their own skin in the game. My favorite scientist is a guy named Justin. Um, oh God, his name is escaping me now. It's something like Schmidt. It's not, but he 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 decided very arbitrarily that what the world needed was a numbered ranking order of the relative pain of insect stings. So he, being a good scientist, acquired all the insects and stung himself multiple times all over his body to
Oh,
create a chart. And it's like that there might be a repeatability problem with that study, but if we can find someone who will follow him up on that. But it's cool that that happens. I guess my concern is the the framework that says this is good, and it's so good that we're going to change human nature and what we consider to be good or bad. We're going to eliminate the tribalism add-on in the human brain. We're going to eliminate the capacity for violence. We're going to eliminate these things. To me, those things are not just crucial to our survival, but they're actually intrinsically enjoyable too. It is fun to and a great pleasure to be a part of a team. It is violence is enjoyable. I don't say this as a like a soldier who's been like fighting overseas. I've never been in a fight with someone I didn't like, if that makes sense. I guess you'd call it more like full contact sparring than like fighting properly. But martial arts and combat sports is enjoyable. And the history of suicide and of warfare throughout history, to me, indicates that there are some things that people think are so important that they are worth dying for, or at least risking death for, or actually dying in the case of suicide. Not to say that suicide is a great decision in 99% of cases, but it's clearly expresses a way people feel, and there might be some utility, not just for the species, but even for our own line, in having these instincts and having these desires. And it seems like, to me, rationality is not just superior brain power. Rationality is internal consistency with a given set of axioms. It's just grammar or mathematics. So the value of rationality always comes back to how good are your initial axioms. And I don't know that we have a solid set of axioms um, in secular humanism or in the myth of progress or really anywhere else for that matter.
well, I will say, first of all, in my view, suicide is wrong in 100% of cases. So, in any situation, I think opting for the continuation of one's own life rather than depriving oneself of it is a superior choice. I also think if people did not choose to die for something, if everybody refrained from making that choice, we would have no war. By definition, pretty much, we would have no war.
Yeah,
So, wouldn't that be a better world where the number one cause of human inflicted death disappeared? So, I do think that there are tendencies that are on balance detrimental. Now, does that mean I'm opposed to all group cohesion or teamwork? No. But I think there should be a place for the constructive manifestations of those inclinations without the destructive ones. So I don't have a problem with, say, martial arts or combat sports being practiced as sports, as exercise, as ways of engaging with others. I wouldn't
hmm,
support gladiatorial combat to the death, though,
sure,
because of the consequences. So one needs to think of consequences. And indeed, I think implicitly, to a large extent, societies throughout history have gradually undertaken that path. What are professional sports today? Why are there so many football fans in the United States or soccer fans everywhere else in the world? They can even get quite rowdy and riotous at times, but in the past, these would have been opposing factions that would have actually fought one another to the death. Indeed, even in the Eastern Roman Empire, when they held chariot races, there would be factions like the Blues and the Greens, which tried to wield real political power, and they fought each other in
hmm,
the streets, and at one point tried to overthrow the Emperor Justinian the First, because that was a transitional era from the time period of gladiatorial games, which had been abolished or had fallen out of favor by that point in time, to the more current era of professional sports. These chariot races were something in between, and the old bloodthirst still remained. But channeling people into more benign activities that express those impulses may be a viable intermediate strategy. What are video games or computer games, for instance? There are, of course, different genres. I prefer the turn based strategy games, but some people prefer the first person shooter games. And if the first person shooter games actually mean they take out their tendencies on the computer generated monsters and they don't take their pitchforks and storm City Hall or engage in armed violence in the streets, that's a major improvement from the standpoint of everybody else's well being. So
right,
technology can help with those tendencies. I'm not suggesting we re engineer our brains right away. So I'm not telling people go
hmm,
out and get a Neuralink implant right now. I am saying over time, with the aid of technology, sometimes external technology that reconfigures our incentives, we should try to make the best of our human natures, express the better angels of our nature, and channel any potentially destructive drives into innocuous or benign directions.
hmm. Yeah, I get where you're coming from, and it makes sense within the sort of rationalist enlightenment frame of someone like Steven Pinker. Um, what then do you make of the fact that throughout all of history, people have been so willing to fight wars, um, and to not just kill others, but to risk death themselves, often in a suicidal, like Charge of the Light Brigade kind of way. And I know that, in modern times, as in like within the last 2,500 years or so, it's been largely, city states directing their people to go and fight. But before that time, before the age of civilization, we were just as dominated by wars. It was just intrafamilial wars or intra-business wars. We had blood feuds. And arguably, you mentioned your opposition to death began with a sense of injustice towards death. and maybe we'll close on that because we've been going for an hour. But before we get to that, I think the entire idea of justice and indeed objectivity seems to be seems to have been invented in order to curb this blood feud tendency, which was so ubiquitous and is the consistent horror of the ancient world. And so we civilization did do away with the blood feud, but now we have these world wars that um, killed just as many people. I actually found out earlier today that someone I had met and strangely went to Ukraine to fight died over there
Oh,
recently.
that's such a
So
tragedy.
um,
I have tried to dissuade people from going to Ukraine and fight, by the way. I've
good
had some
good work.
conversations with people
Yeah,
on that. But
it's
yes,
good. Yeah.
you're correct that the primitive blood feuds, the intertribal skirmishes, were actually worse than the wars that subsequent societies and civilizations fought. On a proportional basis, they actually claimed more lives. So if you had, say, two tribes of 100 people each fighting one another and 50 people from each tribe were killed, that's a 50% death
Yeah.
rate. No world war even remotely approached that.
All you
So,
need to do to verify this is look at the mortality rate difference between people who are in street gangs and people who are not in street gangs today.
yes,
And I think you have a rough proxy of what life back in that time might have been like.
yes,
Um, but
absolutely.
but but it
So,
but the point I was trying to get is that the existence of the blood feud seems to indicate that there is um a belief that some things are not just worth killing for, but are worth dying for, and that a world I'm not a libertarian, but to take for a moment, I'm going to put my libertarian hat on and put a Mises praxeological frame on this. Does their choice praxeologically define their subjective preference in that moment?
well, it's interesting because one should consider why people in those very primitive societies were incentivized to make those choices. It's
Hmm.
because, in Thomas Hobbes's words, life was nasty, brutish, and short. So if they didn't die in an intertribal skirmish, chances are they might not even survive the year because a predator would get them or a disease would get them, or they would stumble and fall on a rock and die because there wouldn't be any medical care for the wounds that they received from that.
Right.
So there were so many different causes of death. Life was so precarious and so short. Typical life expectancies were in the late teens in the Paleolithic era. So these people felt like, well, they were already on the edge of death. They could already die tomorrow. And fighting against another tribe, well, that could be an opportunity. The other tribe could have resources instead of hunting game or foraging, which could take a long time. They could just take what the other tribe had. And if anybody could die tomorrow, praxeologically speaking, I think they just saw that the goods they could obtain from risking their lives outweighed the risk itself. And otherwise, their lives would be nasty, brutish, and short anyway. So as
Okay.
civilization progresses, people have more to lose from war.
Well,
And they have to be manipulated into war by the city states, by their governments, by ideologies, sometimes by religions. And they're still reluctant to go to war. And I would say, as societies become more prosperous and more technologically advanced, there would be more resistance to warfare. We already see this in the
mhm.
civilian populations of the Western countries, even though Western countries still wage wars, sometimes directly, sometimes by proxy. Most people want nothing to do with the wars. And the way, say, the United States can wage wars today is number one, it has to be through proxies. Boots on the ground are very unpopular now. And number two, most ordinary people should not have their day to day lives interrupted
Right.
by those proxy wars. So at most, they should be seeing headlines, videos, that's okay. But if anything becomes more inconvenient, more expensive, etc., people's tolerance for those wars will fade very quickly. So
Right.
I think that's progress, actually, even though I don't like the proxy wars either. I think that's progress,
Hmm.
significantly so compared to the tribal skirmishes.
So this is where am I understanding your argument correctly that like these people valued honor, we'll say, because I don't think most of these blood feuds were motivated by the hope for spoils. I think that was an incidental thing that we would sometimes get, but it was mostly motivated by honor. That's even when it happens today, it's honor killings. When gang members kill each other, it's over, oh, they dissed us, so we have to go kill one of their members. There's a 1967 documentary called Dead Birds that takes place in the islands of Southeast Asia about a primitive tribe that still lived in that way. And it was all of the killings between these two tribes were reciprocal. It was like, oh, they killed one of ours, so we have to hit back. And it was honor-based thing. There was once a time when men would value their honor above their life. I would say my honor is my life, and they would willingly die, or sometimes if you're a samurai, willingly kill yourself in a painful way for your honor and to preserve your honor. And they would look at someone uh, in an Enlightenment Western society who dismisses honor in the way that Steven Pinker does. It says it's the thing that we believe exists because we believe everyone else believes it exists, or something like that. Um, and he would look on that person as a mean and dishonorable and eminently unenviable person. And he would say that person is only like dismissing honor because they are not a warrior. They are not an aristocrat. They don't have what I have in the respect of my community. So the the way that we say, well, I think their views are just the byproduct of their environment and the economic sort of environmental necessities of their existence. But we in modern society today have a more objective view of like what is truly good. I think there's some danger to that, especially in a world where many people talk about a so-called crisis of men, where there is an absence of urgency. There's an absence of any sense of necessity for men, that men have become superfluous as protectors and providers in some sense. And since the providing of protection and sustenance was an expression of love for men of the past, I think we've reached a point of society where when everything is provided and people can take protection more or less for granted for now, it seems to be fading away in some cases. But they can depend upon the state that has intervened and put an end to these blood feuds, which is wonderful. Blood feuds were objectively awful, but there is something lost there, and many men are checking out and are um, living in a kind of haze. And by every metric of like quality of living, standard of living, you can hear like Ben Shapiro spouting off, or Steven Pinker in The Better Angels of Our Nature, or Enlightenment Now, how everything is on the steady upward trajectory. We do not at all seem happier. We seem to be depressed. We seem to be on antidepressants, men and women alike. Um, there seems to be more to life than just avoiding death. And if Nietzsche is to be believed, that there is a connection in the intensity between pain and pleasure, that there might be something. I hate to invoke Christian language here, but Christian theologians will talk about the difference between bios life and zoe life, life of the body and life of the spirit. Bios is life is like your heart is continuing to beat. You are still biologically alive. But then there's this thing called Zoe, that's the spirit, the feeling of being alive. And it seems that we're reaching a point where as our bios is going up, we see a sort of on a graph a Zoe going down, an increasing sense of disconnection, an increasing sense of dissociation, depersonalization and derealization. I'm sure some of that's just the internet, and we haven't, figured out the right etiquette to survive with the internet in the same way it probably took us a few thousand years to figure out beer. But like I don't. Do you see what I'm trying to get at as far as the dangers of, I guess the best way of putting it, an excessively quantitative analysis of what constitutes human flourishing?
Well, I think the crisis of meaning that you're referring to is very much real, but I think it stems from a misapprehension of the problems remaining to be solved. So just because there aren't blood feuds every day that one has to fight or defuse doesn't mean there's no purpose left for men. There are so many projects that need to be accomplished, so many perils that befall us, from diseases to natural disasters to problems of governance or societal organization. And all of those could benefit from people who devote their thinking, their resources, their efforts toward them. So I think what is missing is a sense of meaning because of the postmodern era's deconstruction of prior narratives.
Hmm.
And we do need new narratives, but I would say those narratives should rekindle a sense that progress is possible, and that in particular, progress that solves real pressing material problems is worthy of being pursued. There are many barriers in our society to technological progress and the uplifting of material living standards. And I think a lot of men struggle with that because maybe they've tried to work, but the cost of housing is too high and they think they might never be able to afford a house of their own. That's a quite salient problem for the younger generations today. So, how can we overcome that? Through technology, through better construction techniques, but also through liberalization of, say, zoning laws and other restrictions on development. So there's a policy component
Uh,
to this as well.
I didn't fully read, but I did skim some of the policy links you sent me, and I am for different reasons on board with our zoning laws are so ridiculous. Um, but I don't think that's what men is holding men back. I think what men long for, man, we've already been going for so long. There's so much to get into. A big part of your platform is not just the protection of civil rights, but indeed their expansion, not just among people, which you also include, but the expansion to non-human entities potentially as well. Um, my understanding of rights, and there are many ways that people can ground rights, um, but my understanding of rights generally, at least in the Kantian framework, is that they are grounded in a sense of dignity, in a belief that all human lives have intrinsic worth. And for men who exist psychologically in a hierarchical totem pole of space, the idea of dignity is anathema to the sense of value that they feel internally. Men long for honor, I think. And a society, what the reason that they are withdrawing from society so much is that there is no longer honor in society. There are very, very few honorable places in society. Men will go to the fringes of society to find places they can compete and find honor. I have found a wonderful outlet for that myself in trade work, where we're working largely among men and all the tradesmen down talk each other. Oh, that work looks like garbage here. And it's a very tacitly competitive environment where everyone takes great pride in the superiority of their own craft to others. Um, sometimes somewhat foolishly, but it motivates them and it gives them a sense of belonging and a sense of appreciation. Without honor, without being needed by others in an urgent, meaningful way. Um, I think society won't really have much of a place for men who feel that way.
Well, I think it depends on what is considered to be honorable, because that is a culturally variable definition. So I would say my response to your description of the need for men to have honor, and as well, the example that you gave, is that it is possible to define a view of honor that is constructive and doesn't involve dying, doesn't involve killing other people, doesn't involve any sort of destructive behavior, but could be honor found in one's work or in accomplishing something beneficial, maybe in fellowship with others, which is a part of the setting that you described. I'm not opposed to that. But the question is, can that concept be repurposed to once again bring out the better angels of our nature, so to speak?
Right. And I think that becomes an empirical question of just how plastic are our natures exactly. Um, I suppose theoretically with enough technology we can warp our brains into whatever shape is conducive to whatever vision we think is best. But I think that vision, one would be very hard pressed to find an objective foundation for whatever vision that winds up being, whether that is a like Nietzschean hyper competitive where we're all killing each other in order to find out who's the strongest in a Darwinian battle for reproductive success, or if it's a completely pacifist, there's never any fighting ever vision, or you can come up with a dozen or more, plausible utopian visions um, that would all have their upsides and drawbacks depending on what we assume from the get-go to be good. Um, but I think the idea even that the life of the individual itself is the necessity that makes all these other potential visions possible, which is it sounds very solid on its surface. Would that not also apply to the longevity of every individual cell that makes up the human animal?
Well, the cells are not individually sentient or self sufficient outside of the larger organism. And of course, here I'm assuming you're not talking about a one cell amoeba, you're talking about some sort of specialized cell
Like a skin
within the
cell or
human
something.
body.
Hmm.
Right, right. And before the counter argument is made that, well, human beings also live in societies and they require some extent of social cooperation to survive? The answer is yes, but an individual human being could move to a different society or to a different role in the same society. A
Hmm.
skin cell, unless it's like de-differentiated into a pluripotent stem cell, cannot become a different kind of cell. It can't become a neuron or a heart cell. So as a result, it's important to respect the sovereignty of the individual. The individual is the unit of morality, whereas a cell is a component, an integral component of a larger unitary organism. So I
Yeah.
think that's where the distinction is. It's just like saying, well, we, let's say you live in a building, you value that building, you don't necessarily place the same value on an individual brick or an individual plank that comprises that building. You could replace one brick or one plank without an issue,
Right.
but you do value them insofar as they contribute to the building as a whole.
Of course. The reason I brought up that analogy is if you have a group of cells with a specialized purpose that don't die when they're supposed to, that's called cancer, and it becomes
Right.
a real problem for the person or the building or whatever. But I mean, this idea of the sovereignty of the individual. I mean, there's a few justifications you could make for this. There's like an epistemic one, there's a political one. But the metaphysical one gets really interesting because we did not create ourselves. We were brought into being by our parents. And there's a sort of a line back that we are not separate from. I hate to keep bringing up Christian language here, but there is a line where it says, "Do respect your bodies? Do you not know that you are not your own? You were bought for a price." Now, of course, that's talking about Jesus and whatever. I feel that way about my parents. Um, my parents brought me into this world, and that doesn't mean that they own me, but it does mean, in the same sense that they don't own me, I have obligations to not them exactly, but to the line, and to my children and to others that that sort of put a big asterisk on the idea of ownership. I am a steward of my own body. Um, but I am not a separate entity from them in the broader metaphysical sense. Insofar as we are not biologically immortal, like a Greenland shark or several varieties of flatworms or um, what's the 3,000-year-old tree, bristlecone pine, and
Yes.
others. It feels as if we evolved to die. It feels as if death is a mechanism of changing the biological composition of the generations, as just as our bones regrow every 7 years or so. I'm sorry if I'm keeping you so long. I know it's later over where you are than where I am here. Um, but I wonder what is the foundation philosophically for this idea of self-ownership?
Well, the idea is, irrespective of the origins of oneself, right
Hmm.
now, one is a self-contained, autonomous, unitary being. So, yes, we came from others, and there's a period of time in our lives when we're dependent on others as children. And those who brought us into this world have an obligation to take care of us. And some may argue we have a reciprocal obligation to them as a result. And perhaps that's a good argument to make from the standpoint of some sort of societal cohesion, as well as people treating other generations well. I don't think that creates some sort of subordination of the individual, though. Just like if you sign a contract of some sort that says you will get X in exchange for Y, that doesn't mean you're no longer an autonomous individual. It just means you're bound by some sort of promise, some sorts of actions that you've agreed to take, or that you find taking to be the best situation that is realistic, or you may even reluctantly accept it, but you still accept it. So, in terms of parents taking care of their children or children taking care of their parents later on, I see it in those terms, but I don't see the individuals becoming part of some super organism whose existence justifies the sacrifice of those individuals. I would rather keep all those individuals around. And in terms of aging and the origins of aging, so there are actually different theories about this in the biogerontological community. The idea that aging evolved in some way purposefully as a way of allowing a species to develop or evolve certain beneficial traits over the course of generations, that is a view that is held, but it is a minority view. So the prevailing view among biogerontologists is that
Hmm.
aging is essentially the result of damage accumulation over time that the body's repair mechanisms haven't been evolved to get rid of. And our bodies
Gotcha.
repair damage all the time,
Hmm.
but there may be certain kinds of more complex, more difficult to repair damage.
Right.
And as I mentioned to you, Aubrey de Grey identifies 7 types of damage within cells, outside of cells,
Hmm.
that contribute to aging. So some species have better repair mechanisms than others. And it could be that natural selection simply doesn't operate as well once one has already reproduced and reared one's children. Some evolutionary biologists will argue there's also a grandparent effect, so it may be useful even to stay around for a bit longer to help one's offspring raise children. But then it's not that people die right after becoming parents or grandparents. There
Right.
are some species where there is programmed aging. We see it in the salmon that migrate and then lay their eggs and die. But that's a
Mayfly.
very different life cycle
Right.
from what we have. So, what we have is just that after a certain time past reproduction, natural selection doesn't really have any dynamics by which to maintain the individuals who have already reproduced, raised their offspring, etc. So it's not
Yeah.
like those individuals die right away. It's just that we haven't evolved the damage repair machinery. Other species might have been luckier. So the giant tortoises, for instance, or the Greenland sharks, they did evolve some better damage repair machinery. So they have been said to be negligibly senescent. It's not even that they don't senesce at all, it's just their rate of aging is so much slower than ours. So it
Right.
is possible, biologically speaking. And if it's possible for the Greenland sharks and the giant tortoises,
Hmm.
why not for humans? I sometimes wish we
Yeah.
had evolved from one of those species.
And to be clear, I'm very pro all this technology. It's on the one hand cool, and on the other hand, like, wouldn't it be great if people could consistently live just to 90, let alone to, like,
Right.
200 or something? Um, I think we finally reached the point where our average mortality age has started to go down for the first time in a while. Last time I looked, I could be wrong on that. But the
Yeah,
point
this
of
happened for a few years, starting in the late 2010s and
mhm,
extending into the early pandemic. So, of course, during the pandemic years, COVID was a contributor. But prior to the pandemic in the United States, it was the deaths of despair, the alcoholism, suicide,
right.
essentially drug abuse, opioid overdoses as well. And I think 2023 was the first year when that decline in average life expectancy reversed. So in 2023, 2024, the average life expectancy in the US started going up again.
Yeah. So the point of bringing up the sort of intergenerational connection and the metaphysical connection to the line that we come from is more about the question of justice, that you mentioned at the very beginning. There's something unjust about death. And this speaks to the mythical narratives that guide us, because it is also unjust, as some antinatalists will say, unjust for us to be born. How miraculous and magical is it, to borrow some Dawkinsian language, that we get to be lucky enough to be alive in the first place at all? And what is the like where is the existential wronging of death that cuts this magical gift that we might not have had short? And maybe that was just a sensation. I don't mean this is not by any means like a an attempted takedown or anything, but it's a curious feeling to have that I want to probe you on a little bit.
Yes. Well, I do think we're tremendously lucky to be alive. And that's definitely not an injustice.
Hmm.
It's wonderful that we are alive. Of course, if we never existed, we wouldn't have had to say anything about it. We wouldn't have been able to apprehend it. And I would say the fact that we exist, the fact that our lives are so rich and deep and nuanced and multifaceted, and we can have all of these experiences and all of these thoughts and all of these potentialities in life, and then one day it's all snuffed out. It's like an entire universe is extinguished, and there's no justice in that. There's no justice in something so intricate and so profound with so much potential just being erased from existence as if it never existed. That, I would say, is not only an injustice, it's a terrible tragedy. Every time a person dies, we lose that kind of universe. So I would say, to me, life is good. And I'm not an anti-natalist. I think the anti-natalists
Yes.
are misguided because they think life is on net bad and therefore it's bad to bring children into this world. I don't think life is on net bad. I think most children who are born appreciate being alive. And again, if they don't, they have some serious mental issues that they need to attend to.
Right.
But I think once one is alive, that life is of incalculable moral value and efforts should be taken to preserve it. I think most people will agree with me day to day, and even in terms of fighting diseases and prolonging life in the near to intermediate term, as you have said. I think based on your comments, you wouldn't mind if everybody lived to the age of 90. So that would be progress compared to what we have today. Life expectancy would go up for the vast majority of people. And I think what transhumanism does, to bring it full circle, is take those areas of essentially near universal agreement, leaving out the people who have mental issues or the Taliban or people with really reactionary worldviews or theologies, but everybody else essentially agrees with that incremental progress. And we transhumanists are just taking it to its logical conclusion. We are taking it to a future where these advances play themselves out and they open up new horizons for human beings, just as past technologies have opened up new horizons that enabled our current state of technological development to be reached. But there have been other eras in history where technologies that we accept and take for granted today were opposed. They were seen as violating God's will.
Right.
Traveling faster than a horse, or anesthesia, or open heart surgery, or in vitro fertilization were all challenged by essentially the reactionaries of their time. And yet, now, even people who express caution or concern or opposition in regard to the next generation of technologies, they accept, by and large, those prior technologies. And even if they reject some of them, like the Amish do, they'll accept others, and they'll especially accept the ones that involve medical care.
Right. Well, I feel like we've been going for about an hour and a half now, and that I feel like
Yes.
that's a very good way to close it. That transhumanism does appear to be the logical conclusion of what we could loosely call the Enlightenment and the project of the
Yes.
Enlightenment. And I've got my own kind of radical reactionary instincts, but not anti-technology in that regard. And Gennady, thank you so much for coming on. Remind the audience one more time the name of your illustrated kids book and where they can find that.
So the name of the illustrated kids book is Death is Wrong. It can be found on Amazon. It can also be found on my website, The Rational Argumentator, in 5 different languages. So there's, of course, an English version, but it has been translated into French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Russian as well.
Very impressive. Gennady, thanks so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Excellent.